I will let Bishops Hanley, Johnston, and Rickel introduce themselves, other than I've just told you that it's Bishops Hanley, Johnston, and Rickel. Oregon, our hosts here in Virginia, and Olympia. We are delighted that they are here and willing to share this time for a real conversation. As Bishop Catherine said this morning, plenty of seats down front.
Yeah.
And I'm going to stop wasting your time, and I'll be back in a couple minutes.
Right. Thank you.
I guess you're the host, you should go first.
Okay, I'll be glad to. Thank you, Bill.
You're very welcome, sir. Sorry.
Well, good afternoon to you, and welcome to Roslyn. If you've not been here before, I hope you're finding everything the way it needs to be, and welcome to the Diocese of Virginia. I'm certainly pleased to welcome you on behalf of our 183 congregations and about 82,000 Episcopalians, and we are the top 38 counties of the Commonwealth of Virginia, with basically the James River to the Potomac and the Chesapeake Bay, and what we call the Northern Neck and the Middle Peninsula, over to the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Shenandoah Valley. It's quite a varied diocese. I have been blessed to be bishop in Virginia now for 6 years, almost exactly. May 26th was my 6th anniversary of consecration, but I served the first 2.5 years as coadjutor and became the diocesan in 2009. So I've been diocesan for about 4 years. And my name is Shannon Johnston. I invite people to call me Bishop Shannon, and so I invite you to call me Bishop Shannon or just Shannon. Because I like the personal way of approaching relationship, and then I tell people that if they're more comfortable using the title or for the office, then Bishop Shannon is as formal as I usually will get. So I do invite you to call me Shannon, and as your host, I'm very pleased to welcome you again.
One of you is the senior here, so go ahead. I'm the junior.
All right, I'm Greg Rickel. I'm from the Diocese of Olympia, which is essentially Seattle. It's the western third of Washington State. So our boundaries are the top of the Cascade Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and from Canada to Oregon. And we have about 33,000 Episcopalians that we claim, about 102 worshiping communities, and of various types and sizes. I've been there right at 6 years too. September of this year will be 6 years since I've been consecrated in the Diocese of Olympia. It's great to be with all of you.
Michael Hanley, and I'm in the Diocese of Oregon, which is the western half of Oregon. As I like to say, it's the place where all people are in Oregon. The eastern half has 22 congregations, and they're served by Nellie Rivera. We have 72 and a half congregations, because we're building one, and about 18,000 Episcopalians, and the area is really from Portland up to Astoria, all the way down the coast to Brookings, and then over to Ashland. So it's a long diocese, and one of the geographical challenges is the fact that the actual center, in terms of where the diocesan office is and everything, is up in the north, and just about anything else is a trip. So we do lots of driving in Oregon to get around. And I've been bishop there. I'm starting my 4th year.
Well, we have been given the question for a panel which I trust will quickly become interactive, of what does the church need from the next generation of preachers. And we've not had the chance to get together before we actually convene the panel, so we're going to be playing a lot of this off the cuff as far as how we're interacting with it. But we've all got some prepared things that we would want to say, and so who wants to go first?
I think the host does.
Well, I I think what we can do is, instead of having long presentations followed by another long presentation, is that we can do a synopsis of what our talking points are, and then see how we might get some responses to that and get some questions and answers going. It's not a hard question for me to answer, because what I think the church needs from the next generation of preachers has been what I've been trying to emphasize for, in fact, this generation of preachers. I think the problems that people have don't change a great deal, but the context and the way in which we approach those problems does change. And so my synopsis would be, what I would like to see from the next generation of preachers is, for want of a better way of putting it, some more teaching from the pulpit. I have heard from, in my 20 years as a parish priest and now 6 years as a bishop in this diocese, I've encountered a great deal of hunger for meaning, and one of the ways that I have understood meaning to come to bear has been in my ministry through teaching, and through so what I would say in teaching, subpoint number one is biblical literacy. Many people find it difficult in the parish to find enough Sunday school teachers, and one of the reasons that I find that I had difficulty finding Sunday school teachers is it was hard to find enough adults who had the confidence that they know even the basic stories of the Bible well enough to put themselves forward as a teacher. Now that carries with it a lot of implications and things that may or may not be relevant or even true. But biblical literacy is something that all of the churches need to be emphasizing, as far as I'm concerned. That's one thing that we teach. Subpoint number two is liturgical theology. When you are a liturgical church and you invite people into participation in a liturgy, fewer and fewer people are familiar with what the liturgy is or means. And if we assume that they know it, they're not going to be transformed by it if they're ignorant of it. And so I think being able to teach liturgical theology so that their worship is meaningful. This isn't about head stuff. This isn't about information. This is about transformation. So liturgical theology, teaching people the things, the significance of movement, the significance of how architecture makes statements. I found that to be a very successful tool in my own ministry where we were. I was a parish priest in Tupelo, Mississippi for 14 years before I was elected bishop here. And then the third subpoint that I would have for teaching is community. We have an increasingly individualistic society which knows that individualism won't get it. So we've got this push-me-pull-you of societal forces that I would argue pull us to say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you're your own agent, it's about you and God, and we don't need the institutions and all of that sort of thing. And yet people instinctively know that community is where they will find their strength. So being able to preach community and free people into community is my third bullet point for what we would be teaching. The second point that I had is very short, which is to say what we need from the next generation of teachers is your personal authenticity. By that I mean to preach from Phillips Brooks' dictum that said that preaching is the communication of the truth through personality. And that has been often quoted. It can certainly be abused, but I think there is a core truth to it that says that you can be free to be yourself and you are liberated into your own stories, your own gift of your faith, and being able to connect with people in your preaching the way you connect to them in their daily lives is terribly important. So those two things, teaching and authenticity, with the 3 bullet points of teaching being biblical literacy, liturgical theology, and community.
I can't argue with that. I've been intrigued by a quote that Tom Ehrlich gave me at one point, which is the church keeps answering questions no one is asking. And I think the next generation of preachers, this generation of preachers for tomorrow ought to be answering questions people are actually asking. And I could not agree more with what I've seen and what I'm worried about as a bishop is the lack of formation. And I think we're reaping kind of a string of time where we've dumbed it down to the point where we don't have formed people anymore. And so there's got to be, we do have to teach. That's got to be a very connected part of our preaching. And it's still the moment where you at least got the insiders captive. And it's got to be the moment where we are really thinking through what we're saying, what we're doing, and what we're teaching. I totally agree with the authenticity too. And the way I put that is to preach from the streets. And you've got to know what the world is like out there in the world that people are coming out of in order to preach to them. And I think sometimes we separate ourselves too much from that. And we go native almost inside the church. And then we become not good anymore to the world that we're actually seeing everyone walk into the doors from. So I would say to be out there more is very, very important for preaching. I was with about 80 young priests about a week and a half ago in Colorado, and they were being very vulnerable. I always love being with this group because they are. And one young priest stood up and said, I worry every week that this will be the last bit of material that I will have. And I found that so concerning because there's material everywhere. And the material is the living life and trying to figure out how we make those connections. So one of the things I showed some people last night from that group was they put Post-its up all over the wall. One of the Post-its was, I lead a church I would not attend. And I took a picture of that and kept it and sent it out and put it on my blog too, I think. I lead a church I would not attend. There's something in that that's connected to the way we need to be preaching. I don't know everything that's in that statement. I'm still working on it. But to me, we've got to start answering the questions people are asking and being in touch with the world and then teaching from the wisdom that you have and that you've acquired and that you know by being steeped in the body of Christ. That is what I think we need for the next generation of people.
I don't disagree with anything that they've said, but I would like to go in a slightly different direction. I am a student of congregations. I find them funny and weird and strange and adorable, and there are not enough words to describe congregational life. I've had the privilege of serving in 5 of them, and they've been all different. And every time I get into a congregation, it was like, well, what's God doing in this place, and what does God have for me to learn in this place? Much more than anything else. And so in that conversation with congregations, I have come to the conclusion that Catherine spoke of last night, that what we really need is leadership. So when I look at what it means to preach, I'm looking at it from a leadership lens. And I happen to really like the work of Dr. Margaret Wheatley. She wrote a book a number of years ago called Leadership of the New Science, where she used scientific ideas to talk about sort of normal leadership skills. One of her books that was out probably 5 to 7 years ago, maybe a few more than that, was called Finding Our Way. And I have a quote I want to read you, which is a little long, but it's been really helpful to me in thinking about this. She says, organizations are never changed by assembling a new set of plans, by implementing directions, or by organizational restructuring. Just that part of the quote right there ought to scare all of us, because, you know, how many times we go, let's do another planning session. She says, they change themselves instead along 3 primary dynamic domains: identity, information, and relationships. In other words, organizations adapt and thrive based on how well they understand why they exist, how well they communicate internally and externally, and how well they build relationships. Organizational change occurs when we use our shared sense of identity to organize our contributions, when we interpret our situations in new ways, letting go of our certainty and current views, and when, through our relationships, we share information that transforms us. I think what that leads me to is that what we need in preachers is individuals who can help a congregation articulate its vision, who can help a congregation build the relationships that are there, and who's willing to tell the truth. Another way it was put is someone said to me once that the 3 things a leader can do in any system is to change a component, to change the relationships between components, or to articulate vision. And the problem often is that what we do is we change components. So when we don't like the head of the altar guild or whatever it is, we get a new one. Instead of either changing the relationships or articulating the vision, which will help that group, whatever it is. And I say the altar guild because I had a woman in Paris who was in the altar guild directors for 11 years and I could never get her out. So, speak from experience. I think that's the task of the preacher, is to articulate the vision, to build relationships across all sorts of ways that we do that in community, and then simply to tell the truth as you understand it.
Okay. Having sort of set forth what our premises are, what response do we have, or questions about what we've offered, so that we make sure that what we've offered has been understood the way we want that to be heard? Or if you've heard it and thought about it in some new ways, how would you bring that forth to us? Yes, in the back.
Thank you, sir. A woman, I think, earlier asked the presiding bishop a version of this question, and I'm very curious to hear what you had to say about it. She was mentioning that the preaching task is held in the liturgical ark. And I greatly appreciated your comments about the way that the room and its architecture speak and preach and hold the liturgy as well. I'm wondering if the 3 of you would care to talk as bishops of the church, and often as the ones whom a local priest would contact for your permission to do tinkering not with the room, but with the words. That often, I know when I've tried to do that sort of local discernment that the presiding bishop is talking about, what I encounter can be that sense of fear, that if one doesn't use, say, Rickel language, one is not being Episcopal enough in the public sphere. I'm intrigued by liturgies that, of course, have that same arc. It's something called Rite 3, it's an unhelpful term. Could you speak to that, whether you're thinking of that as the principal Sunday service or not?
Thanks. I'd be glad to. I kind of inherited, I moved from the south to the northwest. So there was culture shock because they were just, it was the Wild West. I mean, they were doing all kinds of stuff. Some of it was great, some of it I still struggle with, but kind of where I've gotten to that is that if you come to me and say, I want to change this because it's groovy and cool, that's not good enough. Or because I like it, or it sounds better. But if you come to me and give me a good theological reason, a good liturgical reason, a good contextual reason from your community, I'm far more likely to say, yes, I'm willing for you to try that. And that's pretty much how it's worked. Now, you know, there are lines, and I think it's our task to kind of hold that as bishops. You know, we're kind of the unifiers. We're supposed to kind of hold those tensions and really press back on them sometimes. I had one congregation call, and I was surprised by the congregation that called and asked this, the priest that asked to ditch the Nicene Creed at all the principal services on Sunday. And I said, no, you don't have my permission to do that. And I said, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to come up and teach about why I'm saying no. And so we set it up, and I mean, this is in a little town called Squim, which is, if you see it, you think it's Sequim, but it's Squim, that's how it's said. And it's up on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And so I went up there, and they had wallpapered the entire town with notices that I was coming to talk about the Nicene Creed. There were 170 people in this parish hall when I came. And so I talked for about an hour, we answered questions, and I never heard from them again. And they're still doing the creed on Sunday morning. So I think our task is to not just say yes, just because that's the easy thing to do sometimes with tradition. You know, I was told forever that Rite One was gone, it was going out the window, you know, nobody's going to want it, and yet it's pretty amazing to me that some of our younger congregations actually really love Rite One. So I think we have to be careful with all of that and hold it all attention. That'd be my response.
Much the same, my mother-in-law, by the way, lives in Squim. If you want to know
That's
whether
right.
they do it when you're not there, you can find that out. The only thing I would add is that the most frustrating thing for me is when I discover someone not only wanting to do something without really good reason behind it, but deciding that they want to change it on Friday and without any conversation or connection with their community. It doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, it makes absolutely no sense to do that to a congregation without really careful thought about what you're doing and why. So that would be the other piece.
Does that get at what you were?
Oh, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes.
So, you talked about leadership, you mentioned community. That's fantastic. That's very important to me. I worked in camp ministry for a long time. But we don't have leadership training in seminary. It's assumed in our internships or we're being mentored, but there isn't any explicit leadership training, nor is there any explicit community training. Just because we have a community Eucharist and we eat dinner together does not mean we understand how to build community. So we do function as individuals, and then we fan out, we're all in our parishes, right? So we don't get together very often. And what I'm curious about is, for the three of you, what is happening in your diocese to help your clergy develop leadership skills and to develop community organizing skills? Because it's more than just having great liturgy and great worship.
I would love to answer. When I went there, I thought we needed three things in the diocese, and I've talked about those and have kept those for 6 years. One was congregational development. The other was people 35 and under, that our focus would be there. And the third was stewardship of all our resources. And in congregational development, we started the College for Congregational Development, which is either 2 weeks, 1 week in June over 2 years, or 8 weekends for clergy and lay people to come as teams to do the very thing you're talking about. Because I agree with you, it's not taught. It's something that is left to the diocese, I think, to do if we're going to do it. Now we've added to that a 3-year cycle clergy days where we teach Bowen family systems, we teach emotional intelligence, because I do see this is where people get themselves in trouble the most, is with that. Not knowing where they end and the other person begins. And so that's those two things. And then community organizing, I will not ordain a vocational deacon without organizing training. And priests are offered that. We can't make them take it. I haven't been able to find a way to do that yet. But they're offered that, and we will pay for it too if they'll take it. Because I believe that training is a really powerful community leadership training. So I just want to say I agree with you, and I think we on the local level have to figure out how we fill that gap. And I think it's very important, and I think it's very connected to preaching too.
If I can chime in on that, this is, and only in the barest beginning of ways have we at BTS begun to address that, but there are a couple elective leadership courses. Again, they're only elective, so it's not a broad application, but we have actually just formed an official partnership with Voice, Virginia's organized, I forget what that stands for exactly, but it's one of the ATF community organizing, broad-based community organizing things that we're going to begin to build in both in curriculum and in our social concerns committee participation. So there's a little bits and pieces, and I'd love to share more about that with you if you want to come.
General teaching leadership too, but there were only 6 people in class this time.
Yeah, I think,
I won't ordain anyone unless they've taken the college. Or that we have a clear plan about when they're going to take it within the first 2 years of ordination. Because that's what I found at seminaries. I'm on the board of a seminary. It's mostly electives, and they're not well attended.
I will ordain people without that stuff, but I tell them if they don't have it, they're not going to survive very easily. So I scare them into reading the leadership stuff.
And you send people up to us.
I send people to you. I throw a check to his diocese.
I think that one of the things that I try to teach and that's a point in itself. I think the office of bishop should be teaching a lot of these things and provide for teaching in clergy retreats, and we do too each year. And we have a school for deacons, and organizing is taught as part of that. So I think that's becoming more and more of a standard around, certainly from what I know in our province, in Province 3. What province are you from?
I'm Province 8.
Province 8. Okay, so I don't know if that's part of the standard for you, but one thing that leaps to mind for me is a skill for building community. One of the first things that we can do for that is to help the community learn how to laugh together. And that's often overlooked. But I went to a congregation that was very much sort of feeling on the down and out side. They had been tagged as very unhealthy, and they were down on themselves because a lot of people were down on them, and they had become sort of a byword. And one of the first things that I thought that they needed to learn how to do would be to build community, and the first thing that my own inclination about that is nothing builds community better than humor does. So I try to teach people to, it's a cliche to say not take yourself too seriously, but what I mean by that is to be able to laugh together, and to do so in church is an important thing to do, and that can be modeled in preaching, can be invited in preaching, instead of having everything be sort of ominous feeling or authoritative and that kind of thing. To be able to offer humor is a big part of how communities trust one another. So that's something that I think people could take and run with in terms of learning to do that. But I agree with you. It's not taught. And just because it's there doesn't mean that the community is actually there. There's a difference between community and assembly.
Fresh Start also has some, so we have Fresh Start in our diocese. It works very well, and there are some elements of leadership development in that. Plus, we also have a pretty strong mentorship. So when folks come into the diocese, and it doesn't matter how long they've been clergy, they get a mentor, so they can learn about the diocese and learn about the culture and learn about who we are and how we function.
But two of you talked about teaching being important in preaching. Earlier this week, one of our faculty members reminded us that our preaching is not adult formation hour. So where can you kind of go into the nuances of where to draw the line with differences between adult formation and preaching during a worship service, and maybe even where you see that changing with fewer people going to adult formation?
My first response to that is what I was told by my homiletics professor many years ago, is that the first exegesis you have to do is of your congregation. You have to know who you're preaching to, and if you have people who in fact are no stranger to formation and to liturgy and think you're going to be preaching in one way, you'll be doing a lot of proclamation and a lot of encouraging. But if you have a lot of visitors or you have a lot of context where people are not as well formed, for example, I've known congregations that haven't had basic Christian education for almost a generation. You may have to do some teaching in that, but it has to be, it has to have the same quality of preaching the good news that proclamation or encouragement would have. It doesn't, I agree that you can't make it pedantic, but teaching is a bigger phrase, is a bigger concept than information. But I agree with that.
Yeah, I think I would just would answer it by saying, at the end of your preparation or thinking about what you're going to say and do, that's the question to ask. What at the end of this will have been taught? And I don't think it can be adult formation. I mean, I think that's going to be it. But there's got to be woven into it. I thought the presiding bishop did that. So she teaches a little bit as she goes along. And I think it's that's part of the art of preaching.
Yes.
Yeah, Shannon, you talked about this question of biblical literacy, and also just mentioned Christian education. It's interesting, a couple of months ago, we had a diocesan level conference for the diocese in Kentucky in Louisville, and Tom Long and Will Willimon independently talked about that and talked about how preachers had to explain what was going on. You can't assume that people know who the Good Samaritan was. Bill Hefcock, in a workshop just before this one, said the same thing, and really talking mainly about younger people coming to church today, assuming they do come, that they just have no common knowledge that preachers can assume in terms of using biblical references and so on. Is this something that all of you see? It sounds like enough people are looking at this. This is a serious issue.
Yeah, it's serious. I mean, I think it's just what I was saying earlier. I see a lot of illiteracy about our faith. Certainly biblically, I think we signed it over because we almost ran from it. The progressive church did, and I think we're reaping some of those things now. And I totally agree with that. That part of the teaching within a sermon is to assume that people don't know this story.
Yeah, it certainly is a very serious question. And my first point about biblical literacy is that our first task is our own biblical literacy. that we can't assume that we know the story, no matter how well we've studied it or how many times we've done it. There's always going to be more to glean. That's one level of it. At another level, I was in seminary in the 80s, and we had a first-year seminarian who came to do the reading in evening prayer. We did evensong every day, and came to do the reading, and the reading happened to be from the book of Hebrews, and he was looking for it in the Old Testament. And so that's a postulate. And so that's another level of it, is that we bishops have to be very careful about the formation and how people are engaging their own biblical literacy, whether it's through private devotional reading and studious reading and theological formation, or if it's digging in for the umpteenth time into the Good Samaritan. But you should always find new angles for the stories. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak to your words about vision and preaching vision, and it's in the context of parish ministry and the main preacher on Sundays, for the sake of argument. And I'm wondering, when we preach from the real world, and we're talking about community, we've got the community of the parish, we've got the community of the town, of the state, of the nation, of the world. And I'm wondering, what I was wondering is if there are limits to, let's say you're tasked with some major change or development in a parish setting specifically, within the local community you preach to regularly, whether there's a limit to using the preaching pulpit or the preaching opportunity to talk about what's going on in the parish and how we're all doing and how we're moving towards this goal, and whether that can get a little bit tiresome sometimes for a congregation, and whether we have to limit how much we might use that space to talk about very local issues about how the specific parish is evolving and developing with needs that are required.
I like what Catherine said last night about being vulnerable, and I think that you have to be somewhat careful and savvy, and you have to think carefully about what you're going to say to the community about vision and about where they're taking, where they're going. It's easy to say it in sort of broad general terms. God is, you use God language and a few things about justice and faith, and yeah, that feels really good. But when you get down to the particulars of a community and inviting them to consider where God is leading them, particularly when you move toward the specifics of what that looks like, it takes you do have to do it. I think you have to do it and articulate where you think God's calling them, and but do it in dialogue. Know that you don't know everything, and that you come with the notion of where you think the text and the parish meet in terms of where the call of God is, but always do it with the notion that you could be terribly wrong.
Yeah, I think vulnerability is a great leadership virtue. I say that a lot because I find less and less of it, and I see people get into trouble because they aren't able to do that. I think what you said is very good, though. You have to be careful about how often you do that. It can certainly be overused. But I would share this story. Early on in my ministry, the very first time, and one of only few that I've gotten a standing ovation after a sermon, was one where I did something like that, and it was a vulnerable time. It was the first time anybody was after my head, actually, because we had listed thank yous for those people who had pledged for the first time ever in the parish. We sent me amounts. We had an alphabetical order, just listed the names. And there were people, all this triangulation going on about, that's over the top, he needs to go. And the senior warden asked me, what are you going to do about it? So I'm going to preach about it Sunday. And so I started the sermon, I remember, with, if you're visiting today, I really want to apologize. Because we've got a big stinking elephant in the middle of our living room, and we've got to do some housekeeping. And I talked about, basically the tenor of the thing was, it's not what the issue is, it's how we, as the body of Christ, respond to the issues. And we're not going to do it like this. And, spilled out lots of other things. And so when I left the pulpit, it was one of these pulpits you climbed into, and out of, I heard this roar, which I thought they were storming in to take me. But it was a standing ovation, and I didn't hear another word about that after that was over. And I actually had some of the people come and reconcile who had been out there doing all that. The very interesting thing, though, is that two people that were visiting that day came up and said, we would come back here in a second, because this is the kind of community we want to be part of, that you can be that honest with each other, and that you can talk about things like this. So, but I couldn't have dreamt that up or written that script. That just happened. And I think you have to be careful about how many times you use it that way, but I think it can be and should be at times.
We've heard voiced a few times over the last few days the question about seminary education actually preparing us for the ministry. And three areas of concern I think have come up really clearly: maybe organizing leadership, basic administration, how to implement budgets and lead coordinating faculty, learning Spanish. So things like that come up, but we've all have a lot of experience with youth groups and learning groups. Are there other areas most of us have a year left where you encourage us to see growth or cultivate certain skills around this year?
Well, you've listed, and I want to say that I don't want to jump all over seminaries. I think they do what they do well. I think it's a little bit of an old model, which the church is going to have to come to grips with about, because that's still the model we want. But I would say our seminaries do a good job of doing what they do. It's an academic preparation. But the reality is, what I see priests coming out into is that is not what means the most, especially in those first few months of what you're trying to do. Especially if you get plopped into a place where you don't have a mentor and you're the first person in charge. It's just like sending you out into the wolves. I just hate to say that. But I mean, if you're not prepared for all the things that you listed, for me, I think being steeped in family systems theory and how that's going to work and what triangulation is and all of that, if you don't know that and understand that, I just see people get eaten alive by it and make really vocation-altering decisions in a short period of time. I don't know how to put it more bluntly. You ask, and that's what I'm saying.
I think there was a time when I came out of seminary in 1981, I went right into a curacy, and I was a curate for 3 years, and then I was an assisting priest. So I had a ton of years where I could learn either from a really good priest or a really bad priest. You learn either way.
One hopes.
But as the assistant, they always like you, and they don't generally get angry at you for for whatever is going on in the parish. They'll nail the rector for that. So it gave new clergy a way to learn some of the craft that you didn't get in seminary. We don't have those very much anymore. A lot of most of us who are bishops are trying to figure out how do we get more opportunities for people to come from seminary into that kind of a learning environment. But it's difficult. And I think Fresh Start was a church-wide attempt to say, how do we give people some of that skill and a place to have that conversation about things you didn't get in seminary, and where it's happening. In my diocese, we really like it. It's going well. We have good leaders running it, and it's doing a good job. I don't think you're doing Fresh Start anymore.
No, we created our own version.
But some way to do that, and like Greg said, I think you named most of the areas that even how to deal with how to manage, how to work with musicians who are in the congregation is it's a big part of how Sunday morning ends up being transformative. And if you don't know how to do that, it's going to make it a whole lot harder.
There's really a bigger issue too. We get locked into looking at the seminaries, but I think it goes all the way back to the diocese really before seminary. Because seminaries will not make a priest. But I think our system still operates on that understanding and that belief.
You mentioned several of the things that I would do, but you left off one that's become a soapbox of mine, which is the use of the voice. I am by temperament and by practice high church, even though I'm Bishop of Virginia.
God plays
But I had someone who was trying and to really get at me in my first parish where I too was a curate. They said, for someone who's such a Catholic, your preaching is so damned evangelical. And I asked Bill what he meant by that, and he started to describe the way my voice would rise and fall. That you could create a kind of in the best sense of that, how drama communicates meaning, so that otherness occurs. And I was, before seminary, I worked as a troupe actor for a dinner theater, and so I learned a lot of theatrical ways about using your voice, and I don't want to press that too far because we're not doing theater. But it is the use of the voice, vocal inflection, from volume to tempo to body language in extending the concept are things that are really overlooked, and in fact in many places sort of downplayed and looked down upon. But I've heard many sermons and I've heard many liturgies delivered as if they were reading the Sears catalog. And there's a tremendous amount of power that can be delivered by the way the voice is used and tempo is varied and volume is raised or lowered or intensity is revved up. And we're not teaching that very well in my experience, but I think it's something that I hope people learn from each other in. Yes?
There's a lot of iconic voices, from Fred Craddock to Tom Long, and Barbara Brown Taylor was at BTS sometime past year, and she made a statement and claimed that the traditional model of the 10 to 12 minute sermon in the middle of liturgy is dead. Do you agree? What do you think of that statement, or if you don't agree, or what are your thoughts on that?
Did she give you the other plan? Or?
Yeah. I think she has a book coming out.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So we have all the way by the book, she didn't really say.
Yeah.
But
A lot of them are dead, I would say that, but I don't know if that model is dead.
yeah, if by that she means that there are other ways to do the craft of preaching and other ways to get the word of God into people's lives, she's right. If by that she means that we are likely not to be called upon as clergy to do 10 or 12-minute sermons in the near short term, then she's wrong.
And I am
In
very,
most places.
very suspicious of one-size-fits-all kinds of comments. In some contexts, that may be perfectly true. In others, and I came here from the Deep South, most of the Christian communities were used to 40-minute sermons, and they packed them in. So I don't like saying that this is true for all places in all cases, but I can see what she's getting at, and I think part of what is really going on there is the sense that something routine is occurring, and sermons must never be a deliverer of the routine. It's now time for me to get up and I have to say something about, there should be a sense of otherness, I'll say it again. And there's got to be something momentous, literally, about it as well as figuratively. And so I think when we're saying that the 10 to 12 minute sermon in the middle of the liturgy is dead, what is really being exposed there is the routine of that pattern. And I hope it gets broken.
Story I think of when you say that is when I finally got Church of the Apostles, which is kind of the emerging church in Seattle, to do the convention liturgy. Josh might have been there for this, and I had all kinds of pushback about that because they're going to bring drums and all this stuff. It was a beautiful liturgy. It was great. And a guy came up to me and said, I get it now. Drums aren't bad. Bad drums are bad. And what I'd say is the 10 to 12 minute sermon's not bad. Bad 10 to 12 minute sermon. And I think that may be what we need.
The other, when I talk to my 30-year-old daughter about this stuff, she says she wants to go to a church where she can take her coffee and sit in a comfortable chair and have a conversation.
Yeah.
And the problem with the sermon as it is formed is there's no conversation. And I get a fair amount of laughs occasionally when I go into a church, and I suggest to try to tell young people today that what you want them to do is to come in, sit down, shut up, and listen, and see how many of them really want to do that. They want dialogue, and so it could be on its way out. We may need to find another way to engage people at a deeper level than what we're allowed in that period.
I wandered over to my literally local parish one Christmas morning, incognito as I can be. I sat in the back and I watched two college-age women come in and sit kind of in front. And they literally, when the sermon time came, they got up on the edge of their seat and they were sitting there. And the person preaching that day just proceeded to totally bomb. I mean, apologized for things, went on for 25 minutes, said, I'm going to tell the same story I told last night. That's how they started. And then they read out of this book that's their kid's favorite story. And I just watched the two of them just kind of, before it was over, they were gone, lost. And I will never forget that. They were ready. But they weren't bothered by, I might get 10, 12 minutes of something. They wanted something.
For sure. I mean, I'm from the Deep South as well, South Carolina. And so being in D.C., my sermons go more on the 15, 17, and it was a change of pace from my field day. But I have a 13-year-old, and that's a blessing having a 13-year-old, and that when I leave church, if he asks me something or we start talking about the sermon, I know I hit it. I know that I got it. If he never says anything about the sermon, I know I missed something. And that's been a tremendous blessing as I've learned this craft.
Over here, yes, Mary.
We've had a lot of talk about skill sets that we hope folks being formed in seminary have when they come out. And I suspect for y'all as bishops, when folks come back from seminary, hopefully back to your diocese because there are opportunities, that there's some sense that you're trying to help them find calls that really lift up the skills and the strengths that they bring to it. And I'm curious, and I'm sort of planting a bug in your ear, do you ever ask for recordings of the sermons from the folks that you're going to ordain to see if there's something, you hear something in there, you see the Spirit moving a particular way in that voice that helps you connect them and say, oh, that might be a good place for that person to talk to. Because since they're investing the time and the effort to participate in a conference like this to get the best possible strengths in preaching, and since that, for many of us, is the only 15 minutes we have to have a really intense conversation about matters theological and social and emotional and all of the above is in the sermon, maybe that's a piece of what you might want to know as bishop.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Not to put any stress on seminarians.
We do some of it in Bacham before they ever go to seminary. There's one opportunity where they either preach together or one of them does it. It's interesting how every group works it out. Somebody will preach. Sometimes they'll give it to one person. But lately we've had groups say, well, we're all going to do it, which is interesting because that becomes a bumbling mess sometimes too. But you get to hear all their voices, you know. But that's not enough. I like your idea a lot. Yes?
Bishop Rickel, you mentioned you moved from the south to the northwest. And so I wonder, I know moving from being a priest to a bishop obviously changes the way you preach, but in terms of regional changes for those of us who are going to be priests or are priests, what changes in your preaching did you need to make? And for others, if you may have made those kinds of geographical moves, were there changes, dramatic changes?
Well, I think the biggest one, something that the presiding bishop said today when somebody asked a question about relatively the same, how things change, is that it was jolting for me to be in a new place every week and to be looking into new faces every week. And for them to really, I mean, if you think about it, I was speaking a foreign language. They would need translators. I mean, some of that was difficult. They found it, most people, charming, you know, in lots of ways. But, yeah, people are people. There's more of a reticence in the Northwest, you know. I would walk away from sermons sometimes there and think, you know, I just put these people to bed. I mean, and they would come up and say, I've never sounded like that in so long. I don't know if they're blowing smoke up the bishop's rear or what. But I don't think the regional thing was that much of a problem. What I found in the Northwest, even though that wasn't a nun zone when I moved there, now the Northeast has taken over that category, but it's still like that, is that people that were there were really there because they wanted to be there. It wasn't a social dictate. It's actually countercultural to go to church in the Northwest. And really scary for people to tell people to go to church. We're fighting that now, that you've got to share this, that people are scared about doing that. And if that's not true where you are, it's coming your way.
I had a priest come and talk with me, somebody who's from Portland and knows the Pacific Northwest a lot. I was trying to give the brand new bishop from the Midwest a clue as to what it's like to live in the Pacific Northwest, particularly on the issue of authority. And he said, in this area, when you find that if you've got a piece of wood and it's got a bunch of nails in it and one of them is a little higher than the other, you know what you do? You hammer that sucker down